Welcome to Tech and Houblon, the podcast that explores information technology and our passion for beer. I'm your host, Paul Saucier, and in this episode recorded at Ben's Bar, we dive into the exciting world of information technology. From the latest news and trends to expert opinions, we cover it all, not to mention our beer recommendations. Whether you're a fan of technology, good beer, or a curious listener, there's always something new to learn on Tech and Houblon. Today we're diving into the world of data resiliency, and we have in-house Ian Shave, who is the Vice President of Global Sales for Data Resiliency Technologies at IBM. With over 25 years of experience in the storage industry, Ian brings a wealth of expertise to the table, particularly in cyber resiliency. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much, and thank you for pointing out how old I am by saying how experienced I am. That's a very subtle way of showing I'm old, but thank you.
Maybe you started at a very young age. We'll see. That's my excuse for everything. As you know, I think we've told you, because I see you brought some bottles here. We do, our podcast is named Tech et Houblon. Usually we have beers, but you are an amateur of rum, as I can see.
I would argue I'm nearly a professional at it these days. I'm an amateur, but yes, I do like my rum. The collection is borderline obsessive. My wife would certainly tell you it is an obsession. But yes, the collection's got quite large over the years. Yes.
Your wife probably thought it was an obsession 25 bottles ago.
I would probably say 50 bottles. Yes.
Amazing. Listen. I do like a good rum as well. I'm not as deep into it as you are. I'm not a connoisseur. I think I'm an enjoyer. But I brought one for myself here. It's called Diplomatico. It's one of my favorite ones. Super smooth, very easy to drink. And this is what I'll be sharing with you later. What have you brought for yourself today?
So funny enough, I do like that Diplomatico as well. But the best or smoothest sipping rum that I have found so far is one called Plantation XO. And so that there are very few sipping rums I have found where you don't need ice as well, just to help kind of smooth them out a bit.
Okay.
But this one is really top of the line.
That's how I drink my bourbons, always neat. So you actually drink this without any ice?
Yep,
just like this?
It's probably one of the very few, other than rum liqueurs, which is really now making me sound like an alcoholic. And I'm not. I should say I'm not.
That's why we call it connoisseur.
Yes, that's connoisseur. That's a much better way of saying it. Yes.
Okay, amazing. And I'm just going to mention, because you actually mentioned something early on in our pre-conversation about the banana rum. I know you don't have it here today, but I want to make sure we have it noted so I can actually
I was just going to say, I'm more than happy to spend the entire podcast talking about rum, by the way. But,
maybe that's a different one, yeah.
Yeah, so there's one. It's actually made in the very southwest of the UK, and it's called Bombo Rum, and they do a banana and caramel.
Oof.
And it's only 24%, so it's more like a rum liqueur. But if you're familiar with banoffee, a banoffee pie or something, it smells like banoffee, and it tastes incredible. And I probably have a conversion rate in excess of 90% of people who go, I don't drink rum, who smell it and go, oh, can I try it? And then they buy a bottle.
So we should buy stock in this company, is what you're saying?
I should have bought shares years ago, definitely. Yes.
Amazing. Ian, we obviously know what you can do at IBM in your career and at work. Who are you as a person? What do you have at home? We usually take just a minute or two just to see the person behind the big IBM badge that you wear.
Sure. So when not talking about data resiliency or storage, then yes, I've got obviously my wife, and I have 2 children. I can't really call them that anymore now because, of course, they're now adults. But so I have a 25-year-old and a 22-year-old, both of whom have now left home. So home has become a little more peaceful than it was in the past. But other than that, in my spare time, I'm either cooking something on the barbecue, experimenting with something in the smoker, or trying to get my BMW to be even better than it is already. So,
yes, the car fan in you.
Yes.
What do you have for car?
I have 2 old ones. I think just because I've become old, I prefer the older cars. But I've got an old 1993 BMW and an old 2002 BMW. So an old M5 and a 540. So just old school cars.
Yeah, that's amazing. My first ride ever in a BMW was an M5.
Right.
And the guy that was driving it knew what he was doing, and oh my goodness, it's quite a car.
It's phenomenal. So the really old one, which is say 90s M3, M5, I normally joke that it is phenomenal for the 3 minutes a year I get to drive. You spend more time maintaining it than you do driving it.
Got you. Now the kids are gone. Just a very quick question, and then we can jump into the real subject of the day. But did you convert one of the rooms as your rum room? Is that what your wife is?
I haven't, but I like the way you're thinking. I'm going to go home and suggest to my wife, hey, I heard this great suggestion. I don't think it's going to go down well, but I'm willing to give it a try.
I might get an email from your wife at some point.
I think you may. Why did you suggest that? Yes.
It's Paul's fault. Okay, so let's get into this. I guess that the first question, we're talking about data resiliency. Your background is very much storage. When we talk about data resiliency, for me, I'm always thinking it's almost data protection 2.0. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is what does data resiliency mean?
Sure. So really and as you say, like kind of thinking of it as a 2.0 in data protection. So we've kind of deliberately we're suggesting to people they need to bring together both data protection, traditional data protection, business continuity methodologies, and they need to add cyber resilient capabilities, hence data resiliency rather than using 4 words. Because it's not we're not suggesting people need to replace what they've done before, but they need to enhance it so that it can cope with the new, if you like, relatively threat, which is obviously cyber attacks. How do you come back? If the worst happens and someone gets through, how do you get back? You need to enhance those data protection techniques because those traditional data protection business continuity techniques are not going to help in the event of a cyber incident. And that's why we're trying to help re-educate people. They need a new data resilient set of capabilities and strategy.
Right. So it's almost expanding a little bit. Eh?
Yeah. As I say, this is not a start all over again. This is enhance what you're doing, do some of the techniques in a slightly different way, which is going to ensure that you can have data that you can recover from.
Awesome. So as an organization, the primary challenges that I would be faced with regarding data resiliency, how do I go about addressing that?
Well, I guess fundamentally the biggest threat with cyber attacks is you don't necessarily know when it started, and you don't know how big the impact is. This is the difficulty. So we often talk about, for data protection, business continuity, that they're protecting against an infrastructure failure. And that could be someone digs up the power line outside, so you lose power to the data center, but they dug that up at 4:30, so you can recover back to right just before 4:30. The trouble with cyber incidents is that you don't know when they got in. You just know when everything broke. But they could, there was an example in the press a couple of years ago where there was malware in an organization's data for 9 months before it was discovered.
Scary.
Yeah. So how do you recover? Which copy of data do you recover? That's the real challenge that organizations face. And how do you minimize the kind of the business disruption from that?
Right. That's the key point for everything, right?
Yeah. Because business disruption is money. It's really fundamentally very simple. Every single second that an organization cannot, transact is costing them money.
Exactly. I saw, I had the privilege of seeing one of your presentations, and I really liked the steps to data resiliency that you had. It was very clear to me because we were talking about this, and I'm getting the picture. But then I saw that slide where we have very identifiable, the 5 steps.
Yes.
And for me, everything has just started clicking and putting the pieces together. Would you mind going through that for our audience?
Of course. So I kind of laid out, we talk about data protection. So it is a foundation, if you like, as the first step, that an organization will have some level of data protection, hopefully very good data protection, and they will have some level of, cybersecurity software. It's taken as read that they will have those to some level. We can get into the details about, could the security be a bit better? Do they need better data classification in their data protection? But you've got a baseline starting point, and that's what I meant by we're not talking about rip everything out and start again. That's your baseline. And obviously, that's very important. It's important for them to have the security because the volume of attacks is just ever increasing. And of course, you've got to try and prevent as much as possible ever having any impact on the business whatsoever. The next step we then really talk about, and this is the enhancement of data protection, is having secure, immutable copies of data. And what we mean by that is copies of data that cannot be changed and cannot be deleted once they've been created. This is the issue we've been seeing, that a primary attack vector now has been these attackers targeting backups so that an organization cannot recover. If you think of ransomware attacks, they do not want you to recover because they want you to pay the ransom.
Right.
So they target the backup, take away your ability to recover, and if you can imagine, it's not impacted your production systems at this point, so will you notice? Who would notice that their production has been impacted and they won't be able to recover? You're not going to notice until you try, and by then it's too late. So you've got to have secure copies of data that you know are going to be there. They cannot get to, they cannot disrupt it. It's often referred to as air gapping, whether physically or logically air gapping. So that's a really, really important first step. Then we kind of go into, once we can help organizations with that, we then need to help them discover that actually there are threats in the data. And we talk about this from two dimensions. There's both active and dormant threats. By dormant threats, we're talking about, it could be malware that is sitting in the data, but they haven't done anything. It's just they're waiting for their moment to strike, as it were. If we can find that before they've actually activated it and therefore not disrupted anything, we prevent disruption to the business. So that is a perfect scenario. Now, security tools do an element of that, or a huge element of that they're trying to find that malware as it tries to come through the network and through the applications. But it's important to also look in the data. I've used this example of castles, and I apologize for those, for some, but castles were originally, big stone building, then they built a wall around it, then they built a moat around it. They were building up layers of defenses, but it doesn't stop everything. It is impossible to be, for prevention to be absolute. And so I use this analogy, remember to look back in the courtyard of the castle. What is lying in that data in the middle? Yeah. Do you know what's in there? Because, imagine you've got the CCTV focusing back in. There could be something wandering around doing something, and because you're still looking outward, you may not be seeing it. Important to look back in. And the data tells us that's really important, because 2/3 of attacks are not being picked up by customers' existing security tools and staff.
Substantial. Wow.
It's genuinely a frightening statistic. The way it's actually represented in the report is it says it's 1/3 are. Conversely, 2/3 are not. Yeah. But it's a frightening statistic when you consider how much money organizations have invested in security. It is frightening how much is still not being picked up. So, and I suspect an awful lot of it could be because it's within the data and they haven't been looking, because security tools kind of look before it gets down to data at rest, if I can put it that way. So that discovery piece is important from a dormant perspective, but also, so we actually worked with our own development team and looked at how much data could be encrypted in 24 hours. So if you imagine a ransomware attack, and it doesn't matter whether it's ransomware where they're trying to encrypt your data, or whether it's cyber warfare and they're trying to corrupt your data, delete it, whatever. How big could that impact be in 24 hours? The frightening statistic is 2.5 petabytes could be impacted in just 24 hours.
Wow.
And that alone is frightening. And that could be for a single storage array. So for organizations that have multiples, that could be an awful lot bigger. Now,
multiplication of that.
Yeah. And the reality is, it's probably not going to be at that rate. It'll probably be, probably running at about 1/3 of that rate, because you'll have other things running on the system anyway. But it's a real kind of eye-opening moment. So we talk about active threat detection, because you don't want your threat detection to be the ransomware thing popping up on the screen. That's not good detection. Everything stops working. That's not a good detection technique either. You need to find it beforehand. And so we have developed technologies that help you find if someone is doing something disruptive to your data actively. If we can find that in less than a minute, we significantly restrict the blast radius of what it can then do. So, on the kind of scale I talked about for 2.5 petabytes in 24 hours, if we could find it in less than a minute, we would be limiting that to less than 2 terabytes.
Okay, so the earlier you catch it on that curve up.
Exactly. Well, and it's also because, we across the industry, there's always talk about fast recovery. And there's always the difficulty, what's the definition of fast, by the way. But fundamentally, I don't care what technology anybody comes up with right now, because I'm assuming someone's not going to come up with lightning speed stuff or whatever. But the reality is 2.5 petabytes is going to take a lot longer to recover than 2 terabytes,
Right.
irrespective.
Of course.
So if we can find it quick and restrict, as I said, that blast radius to 2 terabytes, we're going to significantly minimize the disruption to any business operations. Because so often, the entry point is that non-critical system that's sitting in the corner of the data center that nobody's remembered, and that's the entry point. You imagine you found it there before it spread to anything else. That's obviously, so that's why discovery, hence why I've talked about it so much, is so important.
Okay.
And then the next step is recovery, because obviously recovery speed is what matters. Organizations have invested a lot of money in their data protection to have 0 recovery point and 0 recovery time objectives, because they want 24/7 operations. We need to help them get as close to 0 as possible in recovery from cyber events as possible. And we have shown we've got customers that have solutions where we can help them recover in kind of minutes to hours, low numbers of hours depending on their environment, and not the days and weeks, which is the current industry average. The current industry average is I saw a statistic which was over, I think it was just short of 90% of customers take more than 1 day to resume normal business operations.
Really? Eh? Wow.
And you can imagine, what is the cost to a business of not being able to trade anything for a 24-hour period?
Yeah.
And even more scary was 60%, it was more than 4 days. I mean, that would be catastrophic.
Whoa.
Yeah. So that was the 4th step. Last step in that was then obviously the automation, because particularly when you think about the regulations that are coming into effect in some parts of the world, particularly in Europe at the moment, we've heard there's some coming through the Canadian government as well. I don't know when they're going to come, but we know they're sort of looking at it. Having automation and all the right testing procedures is going to be crucial, because you have to be able to, for the regulation, you have to be able to prove that what you've implemented is actually going to work. But as part of best practice, of course, you should always be repeatedly testing that it is actually going to deliver what you think. And I often use this example. For those familiar with IBM, we have these things called red books. Yeah. Because I'm so old, I remember when we used to print them, and they were very, very thick, probably thicker than my bottle of rum. And you don't want to be on page 500 of a red book trying to work out how to recover after an incident. It's got to be fully automated. It's the only way it's going to happen quickly.
Got you. So when you talk about automation testing, this is literally testing the recovery process?
Yes. Well, you're testing, yes, the whole thing. Is it all going to actually work? Is it going to do it at the speed you want? Because I have spoken to customers that will tell me, I have a solution and I know I can recover it quickly. And I go, what have you tested? Well, we tested this application. What about the other 400 applications you've got running? Well, we've tested one at a time. But when a cyber incident happens, what if it's 400? Or if it's 50, however many they've got? What if it was all of them at the same time? Then what would you do? And that's the moment I think a lot of organizations go, oh.
Right.
Because with cyber, it doesn't go, let me just pick on one thing. It's going to try and, the really frightening thing genuinely with these attacks, is once they get in and it's that system that's deemed not very critical, when you go to recover it, a lot of people use network isolation to convince themselves they have secure copies.
Yeah.
But the moment you go to recover, you open up the ports, and that's when they then get in and then disrupt everything else. So it is, you have to be prepared for what if you had to recover all of your business critical applications. How quickly could you actually do it?
Right. Can you describe the clean room very quickly and how it benefits this process?
Sure. So now you can take clean room to all sorts of forensic level of standards.
Right.
I'm not going to try and get into that level of depth, but what we are advocating is kind of like this whole discovery. You've got to check your data. So if you imagine, a lot of organizations are taking copies of data at various points during the day so that you've got a recent recovery point if you need it. Well, make those secure copies for a start rather than non-secure. But then, maybe once a day, maybe every hour, and it's going to vary on organization, go and scan that copy. But you're going to want to put a copy in an isolated environment where you can go and do a full scan, because obviously if it did have some infection in it, the last thing you want to do is load it into another environment which is spreading it.
Yeah,
so you need an isolated environment, put it in there, do a deep scan on it, find out, is that malware, for example, sitting in this copy of data? Wouldn't it be good if I could find that soon? But you also need it for recovery. Because, again, it is a very dangerous assumption to think, because I scanned my copy, that I now know it's a good copy. If you were close to 0 day and you were one of the first people being targeted by a new type of attack that no one had seen before, it could be when you did the first scan, when you took the copy, You didn't even know to look for it. It didn't know the pattern. It didn't know the specific malware. So when you go to recover, update your malware definitions, rescan your copy again before you recover it to production, because the last thing you want to do is go and recover exactly the problem that caused the outage in the first place.
Of course.
So it's so important to do that in a clean room.
Ian, I have a feeling we could talk about this for days. And your English is so beautiful compared to my French accent in English. I could listen to you talk for hours as well. But we're going to cut this short because we want everybody to go on about their day or their evening. But any advice that you can give organizations that are looking to do something with data resiliency? Like we've talked about the steps. I know from experience with large organizations and government bodies, very often there's the security team, there's the CSO, there's the infrastructure team, the storage team, and who takes this on? Who's responsible for this? How do they move forward with a data resiliency?
So very, very interestingly, vast majority of organizations that I talk to are not sure themselves who really owns it, because they'll probably have a security officer or a CISO that owns the security side of it, and they'll have a CIO or some such for the infrastructure side of it. And there doesn't really seem to have been this role in between, if you like, that actually says, I need to think about it in its entirety. We are starting to see in Europe the emergence of what's been called an operational resilience officer, because the regulations they have there all focus on operational resiliency. So they're creating an operational resilience officer because it does span both, and they've recognized they need that. Then, of course, there is also risk officers that tend to be quite interested in actually what is the risk to my business of one of these attacks if I couldn't recover, and that can often be a starting point. But what I would honestly encourage any business out there is come take an assessment. So obviously we offer these assessments, obviously with yourselves, and we don't even charge for them, but it can help bring these organizations together. We've sometimes jokingly talked about the first part of the call can be like marriage guidance counseling, getting security and infrastructure to talk together. But it is so important. And I also urge organizations that believe they're okay, take the assessment anyway. What the worst that happens is we will, after the assessment, say, you're absolutely right, you're in a great state.
Right.
But what I hope we do is find that vulnerability for you before it's been exposed.
Ian, this has been awesome. I know I've learned a bunch. We will most likely do a second podcast in the near future. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to go run out and look for that banana rum that you were mentioning earlier.
Do.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.